Hello friends, my name is Sachin and today we are going to discuss an essential and thought-provoking work in literary and cultural theory, that is Spatiality by Robert Italy Jr. Published as part of the Routledge New Critical Idiom series, Spatiality serves as a comprehensive and accessible introduction to the role of space in literature, theory and everyday life. But this is not a book about maps or geography in the traditional sense. Instead, Telly explores space as a concept, how it is imagined, structured, represented, and how it interacts with power, identity, and narrative. The book argues that space is not just a backdrop or passive setting, it is socially produced and actively shapes meaning. Drawing from thinkers like Henry Lefebvre, Michel Foucault, and Frederick Jameson, Telly helps us understand how space is deeply tied to ideology, politics, and literature. Whether it's the layout of a dystopian city or the structure of a realist novel, space matters. What Telly does so well is provide readers, especially students and scholars, with a clear, organized overview of key spatial theories and show how these ideas can be used to interpret text, analyze culture, and rethink the world around us. So, without any further delay, let's just discuss the book in detail. To build his framework, Robert T. Telly Jr. brings together the insights of several foundational thinkers whose work has shaped the field of spatial theory. Let's take a quick look at four of the first important. First of all, we have Henri Lefebvre and his work, The Production of Space. Lefebvre was a French Marxist philosopher and sociologist who famously argued that space is not a neutral container but something that is socially produced. He introduced the idea of the spatial triad, that is, perceived space means physical and material space, everyday use, conceived space, abstract, planned, and designed space means maps and architecture, and lived space, symbolic, emotional, and experiential space, how space is felt. Lefebvre's work shows us that space reflects power structures and capitalist interest. It's never just there. So, if you want to study in detail the production of space, I have already made a video on the same, so you can check that video on my channel. I'll also put a link in the description box. Second thinker we have is Michel Foucault and his famous work Discipline and Punish and of Other Spaces. Foucault shifted the focus to power and surveillance. He introduced the concept of the panopticon, which was discussed by Bentham already in his book, and which is a model of how surveillance operates through spatial designs. Foucault also developed the idea of heterotopias, which means real spaces that are strange, contradictory, or layered with multiple meanings, like cemeteries, museums, or prisons. For Foucault, space is a tool of discipline, control, and normalizations. Third thinker we have is Edward Souza, and we have his concept of third space, which transcends binaries. Souza, a geographer influenced by Lefebvre, introduced the concept of third space, an expansion of the spatial triad. For Souza, third space blends the real, the imagined, and the lived. It's about hybridity, fluidity, and possibility, especially in urban and post-colonial context. His work is crucial for linking geography with critical theory and postmodern thought. And finally, the fourth thinker that we have is Frederick Jameson, his work Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Jameson, a Marxist literary theorist, views space through the lens of late capitalism. He argues that in postmodern culture, space replaces time as the dominant way we experience the world. Think of shopping malls, airports, or branded cities. They are depthless, disorienting, and designed for consumption. Jameson's idea of cognitive mapping is central. He says that we need new ways to mentally map and understand these complex global spaces. These thinkers don't just help us analyze physical environments, they give us tools to understand literature, culture, politics, and ideology through spatial forms. Telly brings their thoughts together to show how literary text also maps space, both real and imagined. So, what exactly is spatiality? At its core, spatiality is the idea that space is not just an empty, neutral container where things happen. Instead, space is a social construct. It is produced, shaped, and given meaning through human activity, power relations, and cultural practices. This idea, rooted in the work of thinkers like Henry Lefebvre, suggests that space is active, not passive. It reflects politics, ideology, history, and identity. In other words, where something happens is just as important as what happens. Now, let's look at a few practical examples to make this clearer. First of all, we have the example of a bank versus an annotated map. A bank building isn't just a place to store money, it's a symbol of economic power, security, and institutional control. Now compare that to an annotated map drawn by a protest group or a community. This map might highlight neglected areas, exclusion zones, or grassroots landmarks. Both occupy space, but they mean very different things depending on who created them and how they are used. Second, we have the example of urban protest as spatial narratives. Think about a protest march. It's not just a political action, it's also a spatial performance. By choosing to march through specific streets, past government buildings, or corporate offices, protesters are reclaiming and re signifying space. They turn public streets into sites of resistance, reshaping how we understand that urban landscape. Finally, we have the example of fictional worlds mapped visually. In literature, space can also be imagined. Think of how authors create maps of fictional worlds like Tolkien's Middle Earth or Edward's Gilead. These maps are not just for decoration, they show how space is used to structure narrative, reflect control, or signify freedom. In dystopian fiction, especially, the way space is organized often reflects power structures, like who is allowed where, what is forbidden, and what is surveilled. So, whether it's a city, a classroom, or a fictional world, spatiality asks us to see space not as empty but as something full of meaning, shaped by human actions, ideologies, and stories. When we talk about spatiality in literature, we are talking about how space functions as more than just a backdrop. It becomes central to meaning, identity, and power within a story. Robert E. Talley Jr. explains this beautifully in his book Spatiality, where he writes, narratives are themselves spatial practices. To read a story is to map its spaces, to trace its geographies, both real and imagined. In other words, storytelling is a kind of mapping, and reading is a spatial experience. Authors create imagined geographies that shape how characters move, where power resides, and how memory is anchored. If we take literary examples, so we have dystopian fiction such as Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Now, here we have Gilead's spatial layout reflects totalitarian control. The division of space, commander's home, checkpoints, the wall, the colonies, mirrors the strict control over women's bodies and movements. Second one, we have postmodern fiction such as Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of the Lot 49. Here, the protagonist's journey through California becomes a kind of cartography of Peronia. The city becomes a puzzle, its spatial disorientation reflecting deeper uncertainties about meaning and truth. Next, we have modernist fiction James Joyce's Ulysses. A single day in Dublin is narrated through a complex layered map of the city. As the characters move, the reader maps not only physical locations but inner consciousness and memory. So, when we say that space is active in literature, we mean that it helps construct the narrative arc, reveals social structures, and reflects the inner lives of characters. Mapping stories means paying attention not just to where the plot goes, but how space itself tells part of the story. Now, why spatiality matters in today's time? In today's world, understanding spatiality, how space is produced, experienced, and controlled, is more urgent than ever. Why? Because space is not just a passive setting, it's where power operates, where inequality is visible, and where resistance can emerge. So, let's explore three reasons why spatiality still matters. First of all, we'll talk about spatial justice. So, spatial justice asks who has access to space, who is excluded, marginalized, or pushed to the periphery. Think about who gets to live in clean space neighborhoods and who is stuck near highways, factories, or neglected zones. Spatial justice highlights how space is political. It's about fair distribution of resources, infrastructure, and opportunity. As Henry Lefebvre has said, the right to the city is not just about being in the city, it's about shaping it. And Second one we have is urban inequality. So in cities today, inequality is written onto the landscape. Gated communities, slums, surveillance heavy public spaces, and gentrified zones all reflect how space is divided along class, race, and gender lines. For example, urban planning decisions like where to build a park or a police station are not neutral. They reflect whose lives are prioritized and whose are policed or ignored. Protests that reclaim streets or occupy squares become acts of spatial resistance, literal remapping of power. And finally, we have digital geographies. Even in virtual space, spatiality persists. Social media platforms like online surveillance, geotagging, and algorithmic mapping create new forms of inclusion and exclusion. Your digital experience is shaped by where you are and how the platform maps you. Think about how location data is monetized or how content is filtered based on geography. Space is no longer just physical, it's digital, networked, and data driven. So, spatiality today is not just a theoretical idea, it's a lens through which we can understand social inequality, political power, and everyday life. Whether it's a neighborhood, a protest zone, or your online feed, space is always structured by someone, and that means we need to pay attention to how it is shaped, controlled, and contested. So, what does all this tell us? At its core, spatiality is about awareness. Recognizing that space isn't neutral or empty, it's layered with meaning, power, history, and identity. Whether we are reading a novel, walking through a city, or scrolling through our digital feeds, we are constantly navigating constructed spaces. Understanding spatiality requires an interdisciplinary approach. It brings together literature, geography, sociology, architecture, and critical theory. It gives us new tools to read, not just text, but the world. In a globalized, digitally connected, and deeply unequal world, spatial awareness matters. From urban planning to surveillance, climate justice to protest movements, space is central to how power operates and how people resist. So, here's the call to action. Let's start reading space critically. Whether we find it, let's start mapping meaning, not just in books, but in the built environment, in policy, in language, and in imagination. Because the stories we tell and the spaces we live in are always connected. So finally, I am concluding this video over here. Thank you very much for watching the video. Have a great day.